Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, the weekly libertarian news and views podcast brought to you by the magazine of free minds and free markets. I'm Matt Welch, joined by Nick Gillespie in a weird shirt, Peter Suderman, and Catherine Mangue Ward. Happy 2023, colleagues.
Howdy, New Year.
Hey, Matt.
Happy New Year.
All right, Nick, tell your dumb shirt story.
Oh, yeah. So my ex-wife bought me a shirt on sale at Nordstrom's. It's white, and it's kind of like a baseball shirt, Matt. I know you like that.
Yep.
And it's got a lazy flower that says, "I'm not lazy. I just don't like making profits for capitalists." Yeah. And
it speaks to your entire career.
It's also Laundry Day here at Casa Gillespie. So, I figured I'd ring in the new year with a little double irony, since the shirt is ironic, and I'm wearing it
before we give up our pregame banter here, Catherine, were you in bed on New Year's Eve by 11 o'clock or by 10?
I mean, I did make it to midnight. Did I make it to midnight in high style? No, I did not. We played a rousing game of Ticket to Ride, which I recommend for family game playing at like 9 p.m. And that was pretty much the highlight of my evening.
Is Ticket to Ride the Beatles game of heartbreak and public transit?
It is a game of public transit. It is a train game.
Yeah.
But it's about competing train lines, my friends.
It's not about the trolley problem
so it's
over
not
and
like,
over again?
Oh my God, what an amazing board game that would be. Would play.
You are Mussolini. You've got to get the trains to run on time. Otherwise, it'll
Trolley Problem, the board game.
Loses World War II.
Someone in our listenership has the wherewithal to make that a thing.
Do it.
Do it, guys. I will kickstart it.
That's a capitalist Nick Gillespie would work for.
Scott Ewine, super fan, is probably already building out of a 1,000-year-old tree trunk. The board for that.
You could call it the little engine that could kill either one person or many people.
We will not be calling it that.
All right, gang, let's have a podcast. Today is a big day, one way or another, for Kevin McCarthy, the Bakersfield Comet. Does he have a nickname? He needs to have a nickname. The Bakers.
I think he does
that
now.
Would be pretty good. Yeah, the Bakersfield Comet is pretty great. He's the natural, man. He's the last of the young guns.
He is. He is speaking, seeking and speaking, to become the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. We're going to get to that a little bit later in the podcast, that drama. But first, let's talk about the White House, COVID policy, social media, and the suppression of pandemic-related speech. Little timeline for you. In July 2021, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued an advisory calling for a, quote, whole of society effort, possibly including legal and regulatory measures to combat the, quote, urgent threat to public health posed by health misinformation. Critics at the time, including Reason's own Jacob Sullum, pointed out that the very definition of misinformation was slippery at best, subject to wide interpretation, and threatened to create a system of censorship by proxy, as if on cue the very next day, again, July 2021, President Joseph Robinette Biden II said about social media companies, and I swear I am not making this up, quote, "They're killing people. Look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated, and they're killing people." End verbatim quote. This jawboning, as it has become to be known, has worked. YouTube that very summer suspended Senator Rand Paul for a week for saying that most cloth masks are ineffective at stopping the spread of COVID, which back then was super outrageous. And then a few months later, the CDC basically quietly acknowledged as fact. Facebook for months banned people from backing the theory that the COVID virus came out of a Chinese lab. Spotify yanked a bunch of old Joe Rogan episodes that had pandemic-related content, and now we come to find out through another one of those Twitter Files installments last week by David Zweig, in this case, over at the Free Press, that various figures, including Harvard epidemiologist Martin Kulldorff, had their tweets throttled or suppressed for saying things that were either informed opinion or straight up true, but just happened to go counter to the public health priorities of the administration and the CDC. Catherine, here is how American hero Jacob Sullum summarized the latest bits. Quote, the federal government has managed to impose censorship by proxy on social media platforms. Acting publicly and behind the scenes, very angry officials have indirectly limited speech that is indisputably protected by the First Amendment. End quote. So, does this jibe with your own sense of things, Catherine? And if so, who's to blame? And what is any kind of possible remedy or the beginnings of a remedy to fix this trend going forward?
The government is to blame, she said on the Reason podcast.
Boom.
I mean,
did it.
Yeah.
My God, we're really starting off in a brave new direction.
I just like to keep people on their toes. Right. So as we said bazillion times over the course of this unfolding bad series of decisions by various social media companies, these were bad decisions. And at the time, I defended them saying, listen, Twitter's allowed to make bad decisions. Facebook is allowed to make bad decisions. This wouldn't be the first. This wouldn't be the last. And it's stupid to call this misinformation and disinformation when suppressing it only makes it stronger, which I think the Twitter files fallout has shown, right? Like, we would not still be talking about any of this except for that we are digging through the layers of shit that accumulated because it turned out that this was so much worse than we even thought. And the sort of slow burn of revelations about where the government intervened, I think is super relevant because hopefully everyone who was embarrassed, right? I mean, the thing about this you have to remember is that names are named in all of these Twitter files. So we know each government official in some cases who contacted the social media companies with specific requests, suggestions, flags, tattles, as they were called internally, which is A+. And each of those people is embarrassed. Like, this will be a thing that will follow them. I think, that they were in the Twitter files. This is sort of like when people were in the WikiLeaks revelations, and that has followed them in some ways as well. And, I hope that at least some of those people take the lesson. This is not worth it. Just stop it. And the one that really caught my eye that I wanted to highlight was the Trump administration, because remember, this is not just Biden, this is Trump as well, asking the tech companies for help to combat misinformation about runs on grocery stores. There were runs on grocery stores. We remember the runs on grocery stores. That wasn't misinformation. Now, maybe there were conspiracy theories about it. Maybe there were other things that weren't true. But again, the very idea of saying, don't tell people a true thing because they might do things we don't like with that information. It's not misinformation. That's like, we're trying to do a noble lie thing. And if you go back to our episodes from when some of this was originally coming out, we talked a lot about the noble lie. And I think that that's so clearly what this has turned out to be, a collaborative noble lie. And noble lies are never all that noble in the end.
Nick, J.D. Tuccilli also wrote about this. Fun fact about J.D. Tuccilli for you listeners out there, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about the Reason Slack channel, but he is represented sometimes in the Slack channel by using 2 emojis of red chilies. I think that's really great. I don't even think that's true.
That is true.
100% true. If you actually paid attention to Slack, Nick, this is what the kind of thing that you would notice. Spicy, like Tuccilli. He wrote in his piece about this over the weekend that maybe one way of thinking about these companies is not as private companies, but as private-ish companies. What to you is what is suggested by that kind of analytical framework as we try to figure out this realm of speech and First Amendment and censorship or not?
Yeah, first I think it's worth going back to kind of the beginning, perhaps, of the COVID era and whatnot, but and social media, the attacks on social media of. A lot of us on the libertarian side of the equation sort of are saying, well, these are private companies. They can do whatever they want. And we're not really going to have that much of an opinion on what they choose to do, as if they were your favorite restaurant that got rid of your favorite meal, and you'd be like, oh, okay, that's their choice. I'll just go somewhere else, as opposed to talking or bitching and moaning and using voice as well as exit as a strategy for social change or interaction. And I think, I think that is clearly insufficient now to talk about the way that power operates, particularly in terms of speech, in terms of media, in terms of public discourse. And it doesn't mean that Twitter or Facebook or any other YouTube, any of these companies should be regulated as public utilities, which a bunch of people at the Free Press, Barry Weiss's platform, including herself, including people like Clarence Thomas, are talking about. A bunch of people on the left, Elizabeth Warren talks about this from time to time. That way madness lies. But what I like especially about JD's Mr. Two Peppers column, which I recommend everybody read along with Jacob Sullum's, is it really suggests or makes clear that the kind of dogmatic or traditional libertarian critique of power and of limiting speech was wrong in focusing simply on government action, on overt government action. We live in a world that was prophesied by people like Neil Stephenson, all of us, like his work to different degrees, but that, we need to be more attuned to, what, and I'm forgetting the name of the Cato analyst who talked about jawboning, about government jawboning, but the interpenetration of corporate power, religious power, other kinds of social institutions, and government power. That's where we're at as a society. And I just hope that all of the people who a couple of weeks ago were saying the Twitter files, there's nothing new here, this is bullshit, I can't believe that anybody's paying any attention to this. What we are seeing here is a very good mapping of how power operates now. And this is not, your grandfather's censorship. It's not your grandfather's government or corporate power. It's something else, and we need to be very attuned to it. Tucili also talks about in his piece a union-backed kind of bank organization which is trying to change merchant classification codes to track gun sales and ammunition sales in a way that kind of gets around certain kinds of prohibitions or will lead to likely outcries for certain types of prohibitions on constitutionally protected rights. That's the type of thing that we need to be looking at, the way power actually operates, as opposed to anything having to do with a clear distinction between a private company and government.
I also think, though, there's a huge danger there, Nick, in the way that you just outlined that, which is, and I know you are alert to this, but it cannot be that if government interferes enough with a private company, then we can do whatever we want to the private property of that company.
Absolutely.
And I think that is unfortunately the place that a lot of people are going to take this, are already taking this. This sets up, as I don't have to tell you, wildly bad incentives for everyone involved, and it may be true that the sort of pure public-private distinction needs complicating, but at the same time, to say, hey, government's bullying this company, therefore let's break it up. Government's bullying this company, therefore let's regulate what it has to carry. The government's bullying this company, therefore let's mandate who they have to do business with. That's bad news, like really bad news.
I agree. And, it's also fascinating, like what nobody is talking about is the way, a decade or 20 years ago, people were talking about must carry rules for cable companies and broadcast TV. All of that was the place where the public square was, right? And nobody gives a shit about that anymore. And actually, one of the other positive developments of this past year, and Liz Nolan Brown talked a little bit about this, talking about her cover story in defense of algorithms on Meet the Press this past week. That's floating around the internet. I highly recommend people check it out. But that we kind of recognize that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube do not have monopolies on, where conversation takes place. They are not these monolithic entities that are effectively, government, utilities or something like that. So, at the same time that we need to be more attuned to the way power operates, and it operates to try and limit expression, we also need to recognize that, what was once seen as these insuperable monopolies that needed to be broken up by the government, they don't. All they really need is criticism and empowered consumers who are like, fuck it, I'm going
Let
elsewhere.
me take those analyses and reform them into a question for Peter, which is to say, why wouldn't you flow from this into breaking up a large company? If companies that are very large and centralized can therefore just be a tap from which the government gets into your business, the business of speech, or if it's in telecommunications, the business of spying on your metadata, or if you're in banking, the business of having your records reported to the bank, why not break it up? I can hear our national conservative friends and our Elizabeth Warren-like progressive friends saying this is exactly the reason why you need to break up large entities, because it makes it more difficult for the government to exert its will to have a spasm and make sure that everyone is banning Alex Berenson at the same time.
I think there are real consumer benefits to large corporations in many cases, and it also seems to me that a policy of breaking up large corporations simply because they are large and therefore potentially tools of the government is one that is ripe for abuse, misuse, or just mistakes. It's just not necessarily true that every large company is going to be a sort of useful vehicle for government mucking around in people's personal information. I think the better way to go about this is to place rules on government rather than to try to regulate this on the private side. A lot of this reminds me, in many ways, of the food pyramid. Do you guys remember the food pyramid from the 1980s?
I still
There was this
love
terrible graphic that you saw everywhere in schools, but also in journalism, in health journalism in particular, in magazines and in newspapers. And that stuff was just incredibly influenced by flawed notions that were promulgated by the government about what constitutes a healthy diet. And all of that stuff was deeply wrong. And it was deeply wrong about what you should do to have a healthy body. And in many ways, there's overlap with what has happened with COVID. Except the difference is, it's not just that the magazine industry it's not just as what was happening in the 1980s, where the magazine industry and the health journalists in newspapers were following what the FDA and the CDC said. It's more like if the entire magazine business was being publicly threatened by the White House and also accused of misdeeds like killing people by perpetuating information like, hey, actually, maybe you shouldn't eat too much pasta and sugar because carbs are bad for you. Right. And it's not exactly obvious what you do about this. But one thing that does come to mind, to go back to what I was saying earlier, is that we, in some ways, do regulate what people who are employed by political nonprofits, I guess other nonprofits as well, can and can't say about elections while maintaining their tax status. So if you work for a 501c3, you effectively cannot say, vote for this candidate, or you can't say that in your capacity as an employee of that organization. I'm not saying that we should apply those rules to the Twitter side of things, to the Facebook side or the social media side. But I think you can maybe imagine regulating what government officials can say, what they are allowed to communicate publicly or privately, and then make that actionable in the court somehow or another. And so but then you have one thing to reckon with, which is the left-leaning politics of the staffers of these companies. There's just obviously an enthusiasm for this sort of not quite censorship, this sort of workaround censorship that emanates from the government, but is at least, is maybe not always supported, but the folks at the companies are basically okay with this in a lot of ways. And I think that makes this project really quite difficult, because it's not too hard to imagine Twitter making similar decisions, even without direct government pressure. And frankly, even if you set up very strict speech rules for government officials and enforce them in the courts, which I'm not even sure you could do that, there would be ways around that. People can figure out how to communicate and signal things to each other in public forums.
Catherine, I'm going to make the mistake to ask you to speculate live. I saw at least one of the people who was throttled by Twitter.
Figuratively throttled.
whose reach was throttled by Twitter, I think it was Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, say that he feels bad because, chagrined, horrified, because due to such throttling, it affected public policy. Like more lives could have been saved. And if it wasn't him that said that, I apologize in advance. But somebody who was one of the original targets who's been mentioned in the Twitter files said that. Do you think that the thumbing on the scale, which, as Robbie Suave has pointed out in our pages, is overwhelmingly one-sided, overwhelmingly in the direction of basically following what the government's priorities were, which was to get as many people vaccinated as possible and to have kind of population-wide strategies. Do you think that that had an impact on COVID policies themselves and therefore created damage?
I think it probably had an impact on people's tolerance for particularly draconian COVID policies. That is, people in different places arrived at enough is enough at different times. And I do wonder if they had been able to see everything that was being said, I guess, or the things that they wanted to see when they chose their preferences on social media rather than what social media companies wanted them to see, if those moments would have happened differently. But I will say, Twitter and Facebook and other social media was an ocean of garbage during COVID. Is still an ocean of different garbage now. And so I am a little hesitant. I love me some Jay Bhattacharya. What a charming and intelligent dude. But it's a little, I don't know. If several thousands more people had seen his tweets, would everything be different? Probably not. And I do think, you have to take that argument both directions. There was plenty of genuinely false stuff that also went down in these misinformation throttling campaigns, right? There was tons of crazy pants. Your vaccine is going to interact with the 5G to cause your employer's brainwash mechanism to kick in or whatever.
That's not how the brainwash mechanism kicks in, to be clear.
Sorry. Yeah.
For anyone listening who's on the Reason staff.
Misinformation from me. But I am very, very hesitant to say, had we let this cacophony be a little more cacophonous, the truth would have won out in this narrow circumstance, or indeed in any circumstance. I'm not that optimistic. Yeah, it probably changed public policy, but frankly, which direction, I don't know.
Nick, it's not just social media, though, right? I mean, John Tierney, our friend, Catherine's former boss, has written about in City Journal and other places the way that scientific journals exercised very strong kind of peer pressure about people publishing things. Stanford University, cracked down on Jay Bhattacharya, who works there, about this. So there is a sense in which that kind of peer pressure escaped the great cacophony and was in the places where there should have been more actual expert opinion. What does it say about the pressures of conformity in politics? Maybe I'm having a middle age menopause again, but
you really got to get on that hormone. Sorry.
Get a little the patch, but I have a hard time believing that the same level of kind of conformity would have been applied 15 years ago. But maybe I'm looking at this through rose-colored glasses.
On medical issues, on a COVID issue, or something like that.
Public health. Yeah. That people who've been doing research in the fields would be kind of frozen out in medical journals, let alone
I don't know. Okay. I tend to think, and I'm not going to go full Noam Chomsky here, but there's a calculus of consent that's been at work in the modern era, say in the post-war era, from the get-go. And if anything, regardless of, and I'm not saying everything that happened was great and perfect the way it did, but if anything, in the social media age, we live in a place where there is much more cacophony than there was, up until the internet and the World Wide Web came out. So Alex Berenson, who I Googled very quickly to see if he was related to Marissa Berenson, which would be far more interesting than anything he actually has to say about anything from pot's effect on society to, vaccines causing new horns to grow out of people's heads and things like that. He had a good hearing. I think he should have been allowed to stay on Twitter and on social media longer, despite disagreeing with him and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what I think the Twitter files ultimately shows. It's showing how power operates, but it's not new because of social media. And if anything, I still hold firm to the idea that we have more freedom of speech in a wider range of positions. What the real problem for me is a lot of the squelching of this stuff is that it pushes it out of a public forum where people can debate and discuss, and rather than polarize each other or kind of get fringy, it actually, I think, having open, really, strongly argued debates in full view tends to moderate and also, more importantly, find the truth, however provisional that is. So I don't know. And the other thing I'll say is, like, when it comes to vaccines and stuff like that, one of the things we keep kind of missing in the way we talk about misinformation and disinformation, and of course, their little brother malinformation, which started to be talked about towards the end of last year, is that the COVID-19 vaccines had the most rapid uptake of any vaccine that's, been known to mankind. So, it might have had effects on the margins, but I don't know that anything that happened on social media changed this or that in a significant direction.
I just think there's always been groupthink, and there have always been heretics, and there's always been power centers that attempt to punish heretics. I mean, go back to Galileo, right? Like, this is not something that is brand new in the social media era or even in modernity. This has been around for as long as humans have had organized societies.
The last point on this, which I'll make, and then we'll go to our halftime show of baton twirlers. I'm struck by the coupling with the social media is killing us, along with the phrase pandemic of the unvaccinated. Basically the same day, same press conference. It's kind of hard to believe now, but that idea, the pandemic of the unvaccinated, was like central to White House messaging for about a half a year there, until it became pretty ridiculous because people kept getting the virus after they were vaccinated. And so didn't work out that well. But it was, I think, a pretty big tell that they thought that the problem here is the lack of vaccination, which is a problem. I would agree, not necessarily with every single population, particularly of tiny tots and whatnot, but that they saw that problem so big, so flashing, that they could organize government to do anything, just run the bulldozer over that until we kind of clear out people who suggest anything but total vaccination all the time. Just really led to all kinds of blunt force until by the end of it, and this includes, vaccine mandates, which happened in large parts of the federal governments and local governments as well. And I think ultimately we might see that rush, and much more on the kind of employer level, on forcing you to do things, or in the case of New York, where Nick and I live, you couldn't go places. You couldn't participate in extracurricular sports if you were a teenager, unless you're vaccinated. That may end up sowing a kind of distrust in vaccines that we haven't seen, even though, as Nick rightly pointed out, we had the quicker uptake on this. So when these things are all, I think, bound tightly together. And when a government has that much power to exercise its desires, when it's looking at the squirrel and chasing it, bad things happen. All right, enough terrible metaphors. Thankfully, I can't see Catherine in the Zencastr link, so the eye rolling is unavailable to my eyeballs. We're going to get to our listener question email of the week here in a moment. But first, a reminder that this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Friends, the The month of January is nobody's idea of a picnic. You've got your New Year's hangover, a basket full of holiday season regrets. You're staggering back to work or school. It's still dark and cold and rainy and bleak. And the self-shame associated with breaking your New Year's resolutions in the very first week. I'm speaking very hypothetically here. Whatever the cause of your disquiet, chances are very strong you could use a little impartial outside help in reorienting your brain towards solving problems rather than wallowing in them on the couch. That's where BetterHelp, the world's largest therapy service, comes in. BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists. It's an affordable service, 100% online, super flexible. If you don't like your first match, swap them out for another until you find the right fit. Listeners who act now can get 10% off their first month. Just go to betterhelp.com/roundtable, fill out a brief questionnaire, and find your guide through the looming darkness. That's BetterHelp, like prayer. Go there today. You'll be glad you did. All right. Reminder, send us your succinct queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from the delightfully named Dustin James Harper. It's a great pen name. Hello, friends. I just finished listening to the Freakonomics Radio 3-part series. Hold on. You're not allowed to listen to other podcasts. Okay, you can listen to Freakonomics Radio 3-part series about Adam Smith. The main thesis of the series is that Adam Smith's views were more nuanced than we generally think of him. Most people tend to cherry pick favorite ideas from Wealth of Nations while completely forgetting about his first work, Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I'm curious, how have Adam Smith's ideas shaped your own? Have any of you read Adam Smith's works completely? And maybe most importantly, do you think Adam Smith would be a libertarian, small L, he says, if he was alive today? Catherine, have you had to do an Adam Smith weekend for whatchamacallit?
Better than that, Matt. I went to Adam Smith camp with Liberty Fund. It was a full week. And we did read, maybe not everything, but we got real close. We read some deep cuts from Adam Smith. And I think that what is now, I think, a kind of emerging conventional wisdom, that Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith is in many ways the better, more interesting, deeper Adam Smith than Wealth of Nations Adam Smith. I love that for us. Absolutely, yes. I also took a class on the Scottish Enlightenment as an undergraduate, where the seminar participants ambushed this poor grad student who did not really understand that she had gotten every single libertarian weirdo like in her seminar. She actually was an expert in Adam Ferguson, an underrated Adam, scholar of militias, among other things. But she rolled up into this class of absolute fucking fanatics, and it was great. So yes, all the Adam Smiths are good. My personal favorite Adam Smith, though, is neither Theory of Moral Sentiments Adam Smith nor Wealth of Nations Adam Smith, but Index Adam Smith. The indices in his books are absolute works of art. I cannot recommend them strongly enough. So for those who have not partaken, like just comically, they're sort of like if an index for Adam Smith was written by The Onion, like they're just these very comically detailed and specific entries. It's like, fur, the trade of alpacas in East Asia or whatever. Like we don't know, but it's great. Adam Smith has a lot to teach us, man. I don't know if he would be a libertarian because apparently no one's a libertarian anymore. But and back when I was a child, we used to say that Adam Smith would never have worn an Adam Smith tie. That was a thing people said, which I think is like actually surprisingly deep, man. The acolytes of someone are always worse than that someone in almost every case. And that is true of Adam Smith. But I wish he was around now, because I bet he'd be fun and interesting and insightful.
Nick, you're a Scottish Enlightenment booster, or have you come around to being a detractor now? I forget. But like, what's your Adam Smith?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence. Adam Smith lived like all of his life with his mother as long as she was alive. So, he seems to typify maybe as a prototype of libertarian incel type.
It's his 300th birthday this year. Show him some respect, man.
I don't know if they had basements back then, but Maybe he was living there.
What do you think his light level was in Destiny 2?
Adam Smith's podcast would be fire from his mother's basement.
Yeah, sure would be. Yeah. He would be, she'd be knocking on the door like, do you want some cookies and crimpets or crumpets, whatever?
Do you think he preferred player versus player? Or
so what I like about Adam Smith and is Sandra Pert and David Levy in a book called How the Dismal Science Got Its Name talk about how classical liberals, and Smith is certainly a classical liberal, defied hierarchy, whether natural or cultural, as things that are fixed orders, and he kind of helped define people as human who were not necessarily being considered human in the early stages of the Enlightenment or the era of the Enlightenment. And I think that's an incredible, contribution to human philosophy and thought. And for that reason, I think, he's very, very worthwhile, and it's worth going back to. The other thing is he was a classical liberal, and he was not an extremist, even though he was a very devoted foe of mercantilism and other forms of kind of authoritarian economic or social or political control. So I think he would be a libertarian, but he would be constantly being called a cuckatarian in these days, because he's not an extremist. He believed in social spending on the poor. He believed in, finding middle grounds on things.
Public education. Don't forget everybody's favorite, even Adam Smith supported public education. People love to get that one out.
I think, but what part of it is that he, and this is a strain of libertarian thought that I find myself increasingly drawn to. I think people like Michael Munger, the Duke political scientist / economist, talk about this. He believed that a version of freedom is the ability to participate fully in society, or at least have a shot, which kind of implies certain types of public spending on people who don't come from families or situations that would allow that. Hence, public education or publicly funded education and other things. I think he's he's a proto-libertarian worth looking at. Think of him; he's like Iggy Pop is to punk, Adam Smith is to libertarians.
Peter, are you a Smithy?
We've all heard that Keynes quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." I am that practical man, and Adam Smith is that defunct economist. I haven't read a whole lot of Adam Smith, but I have absorbed a lot of those ideas in the same way that I think a lot of people have, right? Even if you haven't read Smith, you have been influenced by his ideas. You can't avoid it. And I think the one that has influenced me the most is just his sense that man organizes himself and his affairs and his economy and his sense of self via trade, right? The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And that propensity sort of extends between, in both into the market realm, but also into the social, personal realm, right? People trade. They trade with each other for all sorts of reasons, sometimes for money and for work, but also for friendship and social reasons. And that these different modes are not contradictory. In fact, they are incredibly compatible, and that is what makes a person in some ways. That is what makes a whole self, is that sometimes you trade. People give you money in exchange for the thing that you do for them or the thing that you make. But sometimes you trade because you like them, because it's nice to make someone else a drink.
My only contribution to Adam Smith discourse is that I feel like the phrase "the dead hand" has gone kind of away. It used to be used as often as
the invisible hand.
Whatever.
The dead hand is like also a thing, maybe, but
the invisible, the right red hand is what has replaced all of them. But no, it was used constantly as a slur against free market type of economics back in the 80s and 90s and is not anymore. I guess people are just like only use trickle down now. The only people who ever complain or ever talk about trickle down economics are its critics. All right, we're going to move on because it's 11:41 Eastern as we speak, and at noon Eastern, the 118th Congress is expected to be sworn in, which means we may see something we haven't seen in 100 years. That's back when Nick Gillespie was only 17 years old. And that is the majority party in the House of Representatives failing to elect on its first ballot a new Speaker of the House. I said we may see that. Well, the reporting preliminarily indicates that. The main character in this saga is the aforementioned Bakersfield meteor, comet. Kevin McCarthy. He's facing a restless and surly Republican backbench, particularly the cusses at the old House Freedom Caucus, which used to be pretty libertarian leaning.
Which it is not at all anymore.
Andy Biggs, the nut sandwich, who is now helping run the thing from Arizona. He's been the most vocal in opposition to McCarthy and with the slimmest of possible majorities that the Republicans have right now. It very well may last the afternoon, stretching out into days, this leadership tussle. Peter, you live in Washington. You've been following this with a certain amount of glee and interest, or at least interest, on the JD2 Chili Slack channel, Memorial Slack channel. What interests you about this, and what do you think should interest us small L libertarians?
Well, I think it tells you something about the state of the Republican Party, particularly in the House. And the fact is that since John Boehner, that the House Republican Party has been kind of ungovernable and incredibly fractious. And we are now seeing that spill out into a procedural and leadership vote here that it just tells you they don't want to be led by anyone in particular, right? It's not obvious for who would be a replacement if Kevin McCarthy can't lock up this vote. And so I think the most likely outcome here is still that Kevin McCarthy ends up being the House leader, but he is inherently going to be a weak leader. If the fact that he doesn't have the votes as we are recording this right now, that we are uncertain about whether he will actually become House Speaker today, tells you that he does not have control or command of this caucus. I guess I would say from a reasoning perspective, I think that a lot of the folks who are opposing McCarthy they're not our best, let's say. At the same time,
they're honorary Mexicans.
No, that's not what I would say. At the same time, I also think that there are real and good critiques of Republican leadership in particular here. And you go back to the Justin Amash era, and he complained constantly about leadership, and in particular about John Boehner's and the way that bills were just sort of written in private and then delivered with an ultimatum: you either vote yes or no, and we want you to vote yes, and we're not going to give you any time to read this. And there are, I think, real reasons to be upset about the way that leadership has conducted itself and the centralization of power in the House and the negative effects on the production of legislation and the debate of legislation, because what you have now is a system in which everything runs through the Speaker's office, and the backbenchers, the folks who are, who may not have, top tier committee assignments, they have essentially no ability to shape legislation except by saying yes or by saying no. And part of what they are asking for right now, and part of the critics of McCarthy, part of what they are asking for is the ability to weigh in greater detail. Now, again, that doesn't make these folks, favorites in any way. It doesn't make these critics somehow or another, bright legislative minds, and it's not clear that they would use their power in ways that are particularly appealing to listeners of this podcast. But just because the people who are opposed to McCarthy are kind of dim does not necessarily mean that the critiques there are all totally wrong.
Speaking of Catherine's ex-libertarian boyfriend, Justin Amash, he had a long Twitter thread earlier.
Wait, is he an ex-libertarian?
No, he's an ex-boyfriend. Libertarian ex-boyfriend.
Okay. Sure.
He had a long Twitter thread earlier today, and one of them, I think the money shot was, I'm not a current member of Congress, but I do know what's at stake. I'll gladly serve as Speaker of the House for one term to show people the kind of legislative body we can have if someone at the top actually cares about involving every representative in the work of legislating. Catherine, how does that tweet and that thread make your broken kneecap feel?
As always, I worry that occasional listeners to this podcast are going to get the wrong impression about my love life. But
it is true the Speaker of the House doesn't have to be a member
in the House.
Of Congress,
that's right. So
right?
There's two kind of silly seasons that politics enjoys on a cyclical basis. One is the Speaker does not have to be a member of the House moment, and the other is what if the Electoral College ties moment. We love those two moments. It happens predictably. We are now in that moment. Amash has been talking about this for a long time. The fact that the kind of the process has been broken on purpose by people who don't want backbenchers, randos, whatever, from the House in particular, to interfere in the serious business of legislating, despite the fact that that's their job. Now, I gotta say, as we are watching some truly dubious characters roll up on the Hill today for the first time, including this Republican fellow who seems to have made up his entire life, but will be supporting McCarthy, we learned this morning. There is, I understand how the Pelosi's of this world got to the theory that they did to kind of lock out people who want to make trouble. But at the same time, this is the point of the House. This is the whole idea, is that they should have input on what gets voted on. And if the theory of this lockdown was that way, at least Congress can get its important work done. Well, no, it can't. No, it doesn't. So it didn't work. And we need to try something else. I guess we can do, should we get a lettuce? Has someone gotten a lettuce so that we can track the length of the McCarthy speakership if he acquires it? Yeah. Like, is there an official lettuce? I don't know if he gets. Kale is robust. Kale lasts a long time.
You can't.
I think
kill
we
it.
need like a Boston bib. We need something floofier.
Something really watery and weak. I think it says something that the most effective Republican Speaker of the House in this century is a convicted child molester, Dennis Hastert, the coach who knew how to strong-arm not just the boys that he molested systematically over years, but other legislators when the Republicans had a very big majority early in the 21st century. Kevin McCarthy is a man without qualities, a man without a chest. He's hated by everybody in the Republican, delegation. I highly recommend reading Robert Draper's book, Weapons of Mass Delusion, which is not particularly out to get Kevin McCarthy, but he really has no principles, no core. He, his treatment towards Donald Trump before and after January 6th and around there, he exemplifies what is wrong with politics. He's the anti-Justin Amash, and he will probably become the speaker, and he will be a failure, and he will extend this period of no decision and of just useless rancor that gets us nowhere slow, for however long he stays.
It's really remarkable how few heroes there are here, which is to say none, right? I mean, even for Congress, you sort of hope that maybe there's somebody who has like enough of a point that you can rally, but no. This is idiot on idiot action like we have not seen in Washington for at least 2 weeks.
I think there is.
It's, it also underscores the Republicans have no legislative agenda that's worth anything. I'm sure they'll go deep. They'll come up with some acronymic, omnibus bill that spells out groomer or something like that. But
one of the O's could be omnibus. It's practically finished.
Yeah. They really are. I can remember, within again, this fucking 21st century is really kind of a hash, but there were times where it's like, the Democratic Party just wasn't doing anything in, when they were in the minority. And that, when you have a two-party democracy and one party is given up, it doesn't function that well. The Republicans are like that now. They're really just terrible at this point.
Obviously agree with your points.
We could use
about
an opposition.
The GOP's lack of bigger picture agenda. However, some of the folks who are defending McCarthy, or at least saying, look, we want to get this vote over with so we can proceed with governing, some of those folks are pointing to the fact that Republicans did promise to pass a bill on day one, as soon as they took the majority in the House, to reverse the funding boost for the IRS that happened under Joe Biden. And that probably wouldn't go anywhere because of the Senate because of Biden, right?
Absolutely, definitely.
It absolutely will not go anywhere.
Yes.
At the same time, that's not just at the same time, that's not a completely useless thing for them to be doing. That's not okay. It doesn't get you anywhere. But it's not it's not the groomer bill that you're talking about. It's not just a culture war nonsense. That's something of actual substance, even if legislation like that is very unlikely, essentially impossible to expect to pass through the Biden White House.
Thank you.
I would just like to issue a correction. Peter alleged that there are no heroes in this story. I would submit that former House Republican Jason Chaffetz, I think it's pronounced Chaffetz, but has two F's, and I'm just not going to do that, from Utah, has suggested on a couple occasions on Twitter that the new Speaker of the House be a cocaine bear. I think that he's onto something, and that is...
Oh, that does look like a very good movie. The trailers were out this past week or so.
All right.
I do agree that if a cocaine bear were the Speaker of the House, then we would have a hero, and it would be the bear.
Do you guys not remember John Boehner? I mean, we had Cocaine Bear on the Hill.
He was like the sentimental.
No, he was a wine mom. Yeah. He was male menopause.
You think
that
man
mom.
didn't do
Are
cocaine?
you kidding?
Whatever. We won't slander him on our podcast, I guess.
Cocaine Mitch.
That's true.
That's true.
But that's the upper chamber,
so to speak. All right, let's go to our end of podcast. What kind of cocaine bears we have been consuming? Peter, why don't you lead us off?
I watched the first season of The White Lotus.
Oh.
It's a show about how people are kind of sad and pathetic, and it's really good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Catherine, have you watched? You're in the group, right? Aren't you supposed to watch White Lotus? Being a lady,
I am supposed to watch White Lotus. I did not yet. Watched.
Does anybody watch like stuff when it comes out?
I watched The Glass Onion
just...
when it came out,
okay.
And it is also kind of about how people are terrible. Actually, didn't love the actually all business people are corrupt charlatans thread, which runs not only through Glass Onion but also through all of popular media this year, but did love the big Agatha Christie energy that emanated from the whole thing. And the internet is already sufficiently enthused. I don't know that I need to pitch it any harder, but absolutely delightful.
I liked Glass Onion when I saw it, but I think it has worn worse in my head since, in part because some of the critiques I've heard of it have made me less sympathetic.
Like
to the show.
what?
It's no Knives Out, right?
Yeah.
But it couldn't be, because some of the magic of Knives Out is that you, even if you kind of knew what was happening when you went into it, there's no way you could have known what that movie was going to be like. And this is very Knives Out-ish. If this one had come out first, I think we'd be like,
literally
oh my
a sequel
God.
to Knives Out?
Right.
Or had been a good
but
mystery.
Like if we didn't know about the Knives Out vibes and we had simply consumed this on its own, I think we would have enjoyed the same feeling of surprise and delight.
Are we allowed to kind of do I don't know that this counts as a spoiler or not, but I'll make an alert for Knives Out. But the final insight, at Ed Norton's character, I think is brilliant and keeps being demonstrated on an almost hourly basis by the current proprietor of Twitter, which is that just, oftentimes people that we think are incredibly smart because they make a lot of money aren't really that smart, especially when they get away from the thing that they're good at. It's always a good time to remind people to Google the defamation case against Henry Ford, or that Henry Ford brought against himself, that destroyed his reputation late in his life because he was a fucking idiot who was really good at making cars or automating processes. But I thought the large ultimate point of Knives Out about billionaires was
I liked
right.
that one line. I agree with you there. And I thought otherwise, it's an experience that has alienated me, not just from the rest of society, but apparently the rest of this podcast. I can't believe the what seems to me crazy overpraise for a absolutely botched mystery that violates all kinds of basic rules of enjoyable mystery watching.
You gotta take it on its own terms. I will say I
didn't like it on its own terms.
I was also reading this collection of new Miss Marple mysteries written by other authors just came out. So it's like,
so is there like a Sally Rooney Miss Marple?
I mean,
and
not
stuff like
literally,
that?
but like, yes, you have immediately correctly captured the vibe here. And so I may have just been in an extremely Agatha Christian frame of mind. I will also have a suggestion.
Those were better.
I thought Glass Onion was good, and you guys are a bunch of haters, and you should find joy.
I like
in life.
Glass Onion. I thought Glass Onion was
good news is that
eminently
critics
worth its time.
Who did not enjoy Glass Onion can now write their own Sherlock Holmes mystery.
Yay! Sherlock Holmes is free from copyright protection.
Speaking of
because
cocaine,
Sherlock Holmes is now completely
some
in the public domain.
No. There's actually a couple that are not in the public domain yet.
Which ones?
Sherlock Holmes' smarter
be careful.
brother. Great
Minecraft?
70s.
No, that one sadly, yeah. But there's still a couple of stories that, for whatever reason, and it's interesting.
The thing that has gone into the public domain, which is good, is that the sort of later Holmes stories in which he has feelings, and the Holmes estate for a long time was using that. The Doyle estate was using that as a excuse to still crack down on some adaptations. If your Sherlock Holmes had feelings, then you were relying on the stories that were still under protection. But now that is no longer the case.
Feelings are bad.
I'm just hoping something happens where Professor Challenger is just destroyed and never comes out into the public domain.
Nick, what did you consume besides Knives Out badly?
I watched, and it's Glass Onion, Matt, which, I would have thought that just the Beatles title would have won you over. But I watched the new movie Babylon with Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt and a cast of others, which is super long, so it's like great value. It's like the way, LSD is a great value drug because it lasts for hours and it's cheap. This is a great value movie. It's by the director of La La Land, and it's fascinating in this sense that it is an attempt to kind of say that big picture, big studio motion pictures are absolutely essential to being able to be alive, damn it, and to have feelings, which is just obviously wrong. And it's kind of sad that there's a fetishization and a glamorization of not just the studio system as it existed in the kind of move from silent to talkie pictures, but just in the public imagination that's so over. But I found it fascinating and really provocative and entrancing for the 3 hours and 9 minutes that it took to do. It had a couple of great updates or kind of plays with people like John Barrymore and John Gilbert, who were silent movie actors who didn't quite make it fully into the talkie era, and Clara Bow. I highly recommend it. I think if you're a movie buff, There's a lot to be there. And then I saw it with my ex-wife and her husband and our kids and my girlfriend, and I was wearing the same shirt that I started this podcast with. And we had very different reactions to it, including a bunch of people saying this was about Hollywood shitting on the very audience that it needs to sustain itself, which is a plausible and interesting reading. I don't agree with that, but it's really good to look at a mass form which is still with us and important, but has fundamentally lost its place of pride, I think, as popular entertainment. So I recommend seeing Babylon. It's also yet another, if I may, yet another instance where Brad Pitt is like Benjamin Button, a character he played. He is aging backwards somehow or whatever, and that should be aspirational to at least Matt and me and the other male menopause victims who are somehow listening to this podcast.
I also saw Babylon and mostly really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating and technically proficient film. It's also, in addition to being 3 hours and 10 minutes, it's so much. It's so intense the entire time. And at first, it's overwhelmingly so. But once I locked into its rhythms and sort of got what I think Chazelle was trying to do, which is these series of incredible sort of high-level set pieces, all of which almost all of which end with effectively a punchline. And he just strings these things together, and it's very episodic. It's almost like a sort of mid-century novel in that way of these sort of, there is a through line here, but it's also like you're supposed to watch it for each 15 or 20 minute bit as much as you are for the whole thing. And once you see that that's what he's doing, and you can just appreciate these absolutely marvelously staged set pieces, I think it becomes a much more enjoyable film.
My consumption was a couple weeks ago. Jerry Lee Lewis, the killer, died. Great rock and roll pioneer, lousy human being. And as I do in those circumstances, particularly when the artist is someone who, everybody knows who he is, but you don't actually go out and seek him out. I asked my local robot to shuffle songs by, and I was blown backwards by the initial choice, which was a early 70s recording during Jerry Lee's country phase of Cold, Cold Heart by Hank Williams. Great song. He had done, his usual rockabilly 50s versions of that back in the day. But his country music character and persona in the early 70s is fantastic. I had heard a friend talk about growing up listening to just knowing Jerry Lee Lewis as a country artist and not as a rock and roll pioneer, because his parents had listened to these country records. I never really quite understood that. Just
was that Kevin McCarthy, the Bakersfield Comet?
No, he can't even listen to country music right, being from Bakersfield, which is hard to do. Yeah. But no, it is terrific. Hank Williams is a one-of-a-kind singer, and you shouldn't be able to sing in a way that is competitive with him, and yet Jerry Lee Lewis does, while also playing piano, kind of rock and roll piano, better than just about any jazz pianist or blues pianist you can name. It is just a bravura performance, and that can immediately take you down the rabbit hole. I can't necessarily recommend a specific one of his country records, and online and on Spotify or whatever. There's a lot of collections. Just go and toggle in between them, and do it to your heart's content. He had really good musicians back then. Those records are really, really good, and you can just see the full force of the man's artistry. He just was an astonishingly vibrant and great musician. And again, a really horrible human being, and who cares for all of that?
Matt,
yes.
May I ask you, as we think about the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis, is there anything an artist could do where you would be like, I'm not listening to their work anymore, I'm not consuming their work?
I don't think so. I mean, if there's a Charles Manson version of Never Learn Not to Love, in addition to the Beach Boys version of it, I'm going to listen to it. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to like it probably because he wasn't very good. but the song is not very good. But no, I mean, I think you listen to everyone has their own algorithms for this stuff. But there's a lot of horrible people out there, a lot of murderers. I listened to Phil Spector, tunes wrote or produced. He murdered some people. You couldn't really listen to Derek and the Dominoes, could you? If you suddenly had like a high moral threshold, or let alone the Mamas and the Papas. I mean, there's a lot of just grisly human beings out there.
I think Mama Cass, acquitted herself.
It's John.
Yeah, no, Denny was getting a little handsy.
Yeah.
There are also a lot of grizzly bears who have done cocaine, like I'm about to do.
Yeah.
Catherine, you're in the booth with him, right? So you can just gut him in person.
I think if we decriminalized cocaine, the whole premise of Cocaine Bear, which I saw the trailer for while watching Babylon, if there was a legal regulated cocaine market, that bear probably wouldn't have been taking cocaine in such large quantities.
I had a whole rap prepared about how my New Year's resolution had to do with Adam Smith. And I got to say, you guys are making it hard for me to keep it right now.
What is it?
I was going to be more empathetic. I was going to bring the impartial spectator into my life. I was going to understand where other people are coming from. And already I'm just like, oh my God.
And you were going to do that. You were going to do that as a rap?
Yes.
Empathy, like retail, is for suckers.
He called it sympathy, so we can pretend like it's a different deal, and certainly not have to talk about empaths, which are not a thing.
All right, let's
except in Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Okay, I think we're rolled
Team
into
America.
the new year, the best we can possibly manage at this point.
Let's stop. Thank you for listening, everyone. Tune in next week for more tales of Catherine regretting her life. Listen to all of our podcasts at reason.com podcasts. Nick, you got an event coming up this week. Is it too late to get in on it, or what's going on?
No, tomorrow in New York City at the Blue Building at 222 East 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, just down the block from the infamous Sparks Steakhouse. In Midtown, a fantastic Reason Speakeasy, a live taping of the Reason Interview podcast with Andrew Tatarsky and Maya Solovitz talking about harm reduction approaches to drug policy, to addiction treatment, and a host of related concepts that would make the world a better place. Go to reason.com/events and you will get information. Tickets are $10. Doors open at 6. There's beer, wine, soda, food, and a hell of a lot of conversation. Reason.com/events.
And if you like what Reason Foundation does, which publishes this podcast and everything else besides and does public policy work, go to reason.com/donate. Think about providing a little tax-deductible donation here in the year 2023. All right, we'll see you next week. Thank you. Goodbye, good cocaine bear.